Spotify accounts for about 22% of the total podcast listens. In fact, it is the second most popular podcast listening app after Apple Podcasts. So, how do you start a podcast on Spotify? In this video, we look at if it is really possible to start a podcast on Spotify, and if yes, then how to go about doing it. And don't forget to watch the video till the end to learn how you can claim your podcast on Spotify. Hello and welcome to the Podcasting University. This is Dilip, the host of the Podcasting University podcast. I'm a podcaster, blogger, and an affiliate marketer. And if you're new to this channel, then you would want to subscribe to the channel and press the bell notification because every week on Thursday, I release a new video about podcasts and podcasting tip, which I'm sure you don't want to miss. So, on to this week's topic, how to start a podcast on Spotify. But before that, let us understand what is Spotify and learn how are podcasts produced and hosted. Now, just like blogs need a website, videos need a video hosting site like that of YouTube, podcasts also need a podcast hosting website or a podcast host. Now, there are a lot of podcast hosts out there, but I would recommend going with a podcast host that is IAB certified. Now, I'll get into that in some other video, but what that essentially means is that the statistics that are provided by these podcast hosts are certified by an authority. So you can rely on the statistics that the podcast hosts that are IAB certified will provide you. Now, most of these IAB certified hosts will be paid hosts, but there are a few free hosting platforms as well, like for example, Acast and Anchor. Now, the next two episodes that I'm going to release are going to be the first one on how to start a podcast on Anchor step-by-step process. And the second one is going to be a quick review about some of these prominent podcast hosting platforms. So stay tuned. Now, there are a lot of other hosts that are not IAB certified, but are still good and reliable hosts like that of Hubhopper and Sounder. I've used both of these hosts, so I know that they are good. If you prefer going with a normal hosting platform that is not IAB certified, then I would recommend going with Hubhopper, which is a free platform, and Sounder, which also has a free option and a premium option as well. Now on to Spotify. Spotify is not a podcast hosting site, so you will not be able to create a podcast on Spotify. Spotify is basically a music and a podcast aggregating platform and a listening app. So if somebody wants to listen to your podcast on Spotify, that is absolutely possible because it's a listening app. There are a lot of these podcasts all available on Spotify. So anybody can tune into that specific podcast that they want to listen to and listen to it on Spotify. But here's something that you need to know. Spotify is not only limited to being a listening app. And Spotify has gone huge on podcasting. Probably they have realized the potential of podcasting and hence have gone huge in podcasting in terms of investing a lot of money into acquiring some prominent companies, some companies that have been providing different kind of services in podcasting. From what I remember, I think they've acquired close to about 20 companies till now, and I'm sure they're going to acquire a few more. Now, there are a lot of these prominent service providers who Spotify acquired in the last 2 to 3 years. Some of these prominent names are Wooshka, Gimlet, Anchor, Podsize, Chartable, and Megaphone. Now, Wooshka, Anchor, and Megaphone are all podcast hosts. So which means that you can start and host a podcast on all of these three platforms. Now, Wooshka is a platform that is specifically targeted towards business users. So their plans are a little on the higher side. Megaphone is a platform that is targeted towards professional users. So their plans are also on the slightly higher side. Whereas Anchor is a platform that is targeted towards newbies and amateur podcasters like you and me, and hence they are free to host. So all of these three platforms are now owned by Spotify. And from the kind of users that these three platforms cater to, we can very well understand what Spotify is targeting. So if you want to start a podcast, then you can pick one of these three platforms and start your podcast there. And when you start a podcast on these three platforms, just because they are owned by Spotify, your podcast is automatically distributed to Spotify. So that essentially means that while you cannot start a podcast on Spotify, you can still take advantage of the distribution that these three podcast hosting sites provide in terms of getting your podcast distributed and listed to Spotify. Now, a typical term, distribution. What exactly does that mean? Let me explain. Now, in order for people to listen to your podcast, they will have to tune into a listening app. Now, there are a lot of listening apps, like for example, Hubhopper also has a listening app. There are a lot of listening apps, like for example, GoodPods is a listening app. Apple Podcast is a listening app. Google Podcast is a listening app. So all of these apps are listening apps where you can listen to podcasts. Now, in order for somebody to listen to your podcast, they will have to download one of these apps and listen to the podcast on that specific app. So, in order for your podcast to appear on these listening apps, your podcast needs to be distributed to these listening apps or submitted to these listening apps, which we call as directories. Why we call it as directories? Because they have a list of all the podcasts that are there on the internet. That's why they are called as podcast directories. And your podcast needs to be there on these podcast directories for people to be able to listen to your podcast. And when we submit our podcast to these podcast directories, that process is called as distribution. Now, with all of this, does it really mean that if you don't host your podcast on Anchor, Whooshka or Megaphone, you will not be able to distribute your podcast to Spotify? Not really. You can host on any podcast host of your choice and still list your podcast on Spotify. All that you need to do is just submit your podcast to Spotify, and I would recommend doing it to all of the other directories, like for example, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, JioSaavn, Ghana, all of these directories. Now, all that you need to do is just submit your podcast to these directories, including Spotify, and your podcast will start to appear on Spotify. But how do you go about submitting your podcast to these directories? There are two ways of doing it. One is in case your podcast isn't listed on these directories. The first is to submit it to the directory in case your podcast isn't already listed on the directory. Now, there are some of these directories that are aggregators. What they do is they go about aggregating all of the podcasts that are there on the internet and list them on their directories. So, which means that the possibility of your podcast being there on one of these directories is very high. If they are an aggregator, they are an aggregator that goes out proactively and aggregates all of the podcasts that are there on the internet. But if it is not there, then you will have to go and submit your podcast to that directory. Now, coming to the second aspect, assuming that your podcast is already aggregated and it is already there in that directory. In that scenario, what you can do is you can go and claim that podcast and tell the directory that you are the owner of that particular podcast. So when you do that, you get access to a lot of the statistics on that particular directory and also a lot of control over changing RSS feeds and checking some of these detailed analytics, etc. So you can always go and claim your podcast on these directories. Now, how would you know that your podcast is not aggregated by a specific directory? It's very simple. When you go and try to submit your podcast to that specific directory, you will get a message saying that the podcast is already listed on the directory. And if you are the owner of the podcast, you can go and claim the podcast. It's as simple as that. When you see that message, all that you need to do is just go and claim the podcast. Now, back to Spotify, our topic. So if you want your show to be on Spotify, then you can either host with Whooshka, Megaphone or Anchor and take advantage of their automatic distribution and get your podcast listed on Spotify. Or if you're hosting with some other platforms, then you can always go and submit your podcast to Spotify. And in an event that your podcast is already there on Spotify, you can always go and claim your podcast on Spotify. Now, for the purpose of this video, let me show you how to go about claiming your podcast on Spotify. And I'll also cover how to submit your podcast on Spotify when I show you how to claim your podcast on Spotify. Okay, so in order to submit or claim your podcast on Spotify, you need to first go to podcasters.spotify.com. You'll be able to find the link in the bottom of the video. It's podcasters.spotify.com. And you will have to go and create an account. You can click on Get Started, and here you can go about creating your account. You can sign up for Spotify here, but I already have an account, so I'll log in using the account. But if you don't have an account, you can log in using Facebook, Apple IDs. You can log in with Google. You can continue with a phone number, or you can sign up for a new account with Spotify. So when you click on sign up here, it will take you to a page where you can enter all of your details and then sign up. But since I already have an account, I will quickly log into the account. So now I have logged in. All that you need to do is just go here and click, and you will find that there is a link that says add or claim your podcast. Just click on it, and it will take you to a page where it says add your podcast to see the stats, link to your RSS feed, and get stats updated daily. You click on get started, and here you will need to enter your RSS feed, the RSS feed to your podcast, which is something that your podcast host will be providing you with. Now I have copied the RSS feed to my podcast. Let me quickly paste that here, and it goes checking, and it will come back and say your podcast might already be on Spotify. Hit next to check. So I click on next, and it says, is this your podcast? If so, hit next to claim it. If not, you can still submit your podcast to Spotify. So it is pretty simple. All that you need to do is just click on next, verify that you own this podcast. We'll send an 8-digit code to the email address. So basically there is a code that comes to my email address. All I need to do is just go and enter that code in here, and then I'll be able to claim the podcast. But if the podcast isn't listed on Spotify, you'll be given an option to go about submitting the podcast to Spotify. All that you need to do is just click submit. It will go to Spotify. They'll verify it. And once they verified it, your podcast will start to appear on Spotify. It's that simple. Saw that? That's it. It's pretty simple. And this is pretty much the same process with most of the directories. And if you're hosting with a good podcast host, the chances are that the distribution will happen automatically because they have their distribution network, and they'll automatically distribute your podcast to most of these directories. So you don't have to manually go and do the submission there. But if you would want to claim your podcast on these directories, then you will have to follow a similar process that I just showed for claiming your podcast on Spotify. And that's it. Now you have your podcast on Spotify. But wait. So the submission is, if you already have a podcast. What if I don't have a podcast? How do I start a podcast? Now that's something that I'll talk in my next video. Tune in the next week Thursday, and I'll show you how to start a podcast. But what exactly is happening? Are we going backwards? Is this Tenet? Jokes apart, don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification in order to stay updated when I release my next videos. And don't forget to tune in the next week to see how you can start a podcast on a podcast host. That's all that I have for this week. I'll be back again the next Thursday. Keep watching the Podcasting University TV.